For over 6 decades, Ron Howard has been America's golden boy, the freckle-faced kid from Mayberry who grew up to become one of Hollywood's most respected directors. His story has always been presented as the perfect Hollywood fairy tale. Child star turned A-list filmmaker, family man, successful beyond measure, and seemingly untouched by the scandals and tragedies that plague so many in the entertainment industry. But now, at 70 years old, Ron Howard is finally ready to talk about the shadows that have lurked beneath that sunny exterior. What he's revealing isn't what anyone expected, and it's forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. This isn't a story about scandal in the traditional sense. It's something far more unsettling, a tale of sacrifice, loss, and the impossible price of maintaining perfection in an industry that demands your soul. Ron Howard's entry into show business wasn't his choice. At 18 months old, he was already performing, thrust onto stages and in front of cameras by parents who saw opportunity in their red-headed toddler. His father, Rance Howard, was a struggling actor who never quite made it to the top, and his mother, Jean Spiegel Howard, was an actress as well. They weren't stage parents in the monstrous sense we often hear about. They weren't cruel or exploitative in obvious ways. But what Ron is now acknowledging is something more subtle and perhaps more damaging. They built their dreams on his tiny shoulders, and from his earliest memories, his worth was tied to his ability to perform, to be charming, to be the little Ronnie Howard that audiences adored. By the time Ron was 6 years old, he had already appeared in multiple television shows and films. Then came The Andy Griffith Show in 1960, and everything changed. As Opie Taylor, Ron became one of the most recognizable children in America. Every week, millions tuned in to watch him navigate childhood in the idyllic town of Mayberry, guided by his wise and gentle father, Sheriff Andy Taylor. It was wholesome, heartwarming television, and Opie was the perfect all-American boy. But Ron now reveals that playing Opie wasn't just a job, it became his entire identity. On set, he was expected to be sweet, obedient, and perpetually cheerful. At home, his parents reminded him constantly of how many people depended on his success, how the family's livelihood rested on his ability to show up and deliver. There was no room for normal childhood rebellion, no space for mistakes or bad moods. Ron Howard the child ceased to exist. There was only Opie, and later, only the roles that followed. What makes Ron's situation particularly complex is that unlike many child stars, he genuinely loved acting. He wasn't miserable on set, he wasn't being physically abused, and he had positive relationships with his co-stars, particularly Andy Griffith, who became a genuine father figure. But Ron is now grappling with a disturbing question. Did he love acting, or was he conditioned from infancy to associate performance with love, approval, and worth? When your earliest memories involve being praised for entertaining others, when your parents' pride is most evident when you're in front of a camera, how do you separate genuine passion from learned behavior? This is the question that has haunted Ron Howard for decades, and it's only now that he feels ready to examine it honestly. After The Andy Griffith Show ended, Ron seamlessly transitioned to Happy Days, playing Richie Cunningham, another wholesome, all-American character. On the surface, his career was thriving. He was avoiding the child star curse, successfully working as a teenager and young adult while many of his peers crashed and burned. But Ron now admits that during this period, he was experiencing something close to an identity crisis. Who was he when the cameras stopped rolling? He had never had the chance to figure that out. His teenage years, which should have been about exploration and self-discovery, were spent maintaining the image of Richie Cunningham, another impossibly good kid navigating an idealized version of American life. The pressure was immense, not just to perform well, but to be the person that America believed he was. Any deviation from that image, any hint of normal teenage rebellion or darkness, could destroy everything. It was during Happy Days that Ron made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would become a director. On the surface, this seemed like a natural evolution, a smart career move that would allow him to stay in the industry while transitioning away from acting. And to some extent, that's true. But Ron now reveals a darker motivation. Directing was an escape, a way to be behind the camera instead of in front of it, to have control instead of being controlled. to shape stories instead of being shaped by them. It was also, he admits, a way to prove his worth beyond his face, beyond the child star image that had defined him for so long. He was terrified of becoming irrelevant, of being remembered only as Opie or Richie, of having his entire identity tied to characters he played as a child and teenager. Ron's directorial debut came in 1977 with Grand Theft Auto, a low-budget action comedy that he also starred in. It was successful enough to prove he could handle directing, and it opened doors. But the transition from beloved actor to respected director wasn't easy or automatic. Ron spent years fighting to be taken seriously, enduring condescension from industry veterans who saw him as just a former child star playing filmmaker. Every project was a battle to prove himself, every film a test of whether he was a real director or just a novelty act. The pressure during this period, Ron now says, was crushing. He was in his 20s, an age when most people are still figuring out their path, but he felt like he was in a desperate race against time, against irrelevance, against the possibility that he might fail and prove all the doubters right. The breakthrough came with Splash in 1984, a commercial and critical success that established Ron as a legitimate director. Then came Cocoon, Willow, Parenthood, and eventually the films that would cement his reputation: Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, and Frost Nixon. Ron Howard had done it. He had successfully transitioned from child star to A-list director, a feat so rare it's almost unheard of. From the outside, his life looked perfect. He had maintained his marriage to his high school sweetheart, Cheryl. He had raised 4 children. He had achieved massive success and wealth, and he had avoided every trap that typically destroys child stars. He was the exception, the success story, the one who made it out intact. But Ron Howard is now revealing that this narrative, while not false, is incomplete. The cost of maintaining this perfect image, of being the exception, of never allowing himself to fail or falter publicly, has been enormous. For decades, Ron has struggled with anxiety and depression, conditions he hid carefully because admitting to them would crack the facade of the well-adjusted former child star who had it all figured out. He describes feeling like he's been performing his entire life, not just on screen, but in every aspect of his existence. The happy marriage, the successful career, the stable family life, they're all real, but they're also curated, carefully maintained, and exhausting to sustain. Ron has spent 70 years being what others needed him to be, first as a child actor, then as a wholesome teenage star, and finally as Hollywood's most reliable director. But who is he really, when stripped of all those roles and expectations? What's particularly troubling about Ron's revelations is what he's now saying about the industry itself and how it treats child performers. Despite his success, despite avoiding the most obvious pitfalls, Ron believes the system is fundamentally broken and exploitative. He argues that no child should be working the hours he worked, shouldering the responsibilities he shouldered, or having their entire sense of self-worth tied to their ability to entertain adults. Even in the best circumstances, with loving parents and positive set experiences, there's something inherently damaging about turning childhood into a commodity. Ron points to his own children's careers. 3 of them have worked in the entertainment industry, and admits that despite his best efforts to protect them, to give them choices he never had, they still struggled with many of the same issues he faced. Ron is also breaking his silence about specific people and experiences in Hollywood that have shaped his understanding of the industry's darkness. He talks about watching other child stars from his era self-destruct, seeing friends and colleagues struggle with addiction, mental illness, and early death. For years, he's been asked why he succeeded where others failed, the implication being that he was somehow stronger or smarter or better. Ron now rejects this narrative entirely. He didn't succeed because he was superior. He succeeded because of luck, circumstances, and an enormous amount of effort to maintain appearances. And even that success, he now admits, has come at a cost that he's only beginning to calculate. One of the most shocking aspects of Ron's current revelations involves his relationship with his father, Rance Howard. For years, Ron has spoken warmly about his dad, crediting him with teaching him about acting and directing, and praising his support. Rance appeared in nearly every film Ron directed, a touching tradition that seemed to symbolize their close relationship. But Ron is now admitting that this relationship was far more complicated than he's ever publicly acknowledged. Rance Howard's own failed acting career created a dynamic where Ron's success was, in some ways, his father's redemption. Ron describes feeling the weight of his father's unfulfilled dreams, the subtle but constant pressure to achieve what Rance never could. This wasn't malicious, Ron emphasizes. His father loved him genuinely, but that love was tangled up with ambition, disappointment, and the complicated emotions of a parent living vicariously through a child. Ron recalls specific moments from his childhood that he's never discussed publicly. Times when he wanted to quit acting to just be a normal kid, but couldn't bring himself to disappoint his parents. He remembers being 7 or 8 years old and feeling the weight of being the family's primary breadwinner. Understanding even at that young age that their house, their lifestyle, their security all depended on him showing up to the set of The Andy Griffith Show and being adorable Opie Taylor. This is a burden no child should carry, Ron argues, yet it's the reality for virtually every successful child actor. The industry has built-in exploitation at its foundation, and no amount of protective legislation or well-meaning parents can fully mitigate that fundamental problem. Another aspect of Ron's silence-breaking involves his years on Happy Days and his relationships with cast members, particularly Henry Winkler and the late Erin Moran. Ron has always been diplomatic about his Happy Days experience, offering bland positive statements when asked. But he's now revealing that the set was often tense and competitive, particularly as Henry Winkler's Fonzie character became more popular and central to the show. Ron felt himself being sidelined, watching his character become less important as the show evolved. This triggered deep insecurities tied to his childhood stardom, fears of irrelevance and being replaced. His decision to leave the show and focus on directing was partly creative ambition, but it was also, he now admits, an escape from watching his star diminish. More painfully, Ron expresses regret about not staying closer to Erin Moran, who played his on-screen sister Joni. Erin's life after Happy Days was tragic, marked by financial problems, personal struggles, and eventually early death. Ron admits that he distanced himself from cast members who were struggling, partly because he was fighting so hard to establish himself as a director, but also because their struggles scared him. They represented what could happen if he failed, if he let the mask slip, if he stopped being perfect Ron Howard. This distancing, which seemed like self-preservation at the time, is now something he deeply regrets. He failed friends who needed support because he was too consumed with maintaining his own carefully constructed image. Ron is also addressing something that Hollywood insiders have whispered about for years but that he's never confirmed: the toll his career has taken on his mental health. Despite the success, despite the happy family image, Ron has struggled with severe anxiety for most of his adult life. The pressure of directing big-budget films, of having hundreds of people's jobs depending on his decisions, of maintaining his reputation as a reliable, bankable director. It created constant stress that manifested in physical symptoms. Ron describes panic attacks before major shoots, insomnia during production, and periods of depression after completing films, even successful ones. He managed these symptoms privately, through therapy and medication, never letting the public or most of his colleagues see the struggle beneath the confident director. Exterior. What makes Ron's current openness particularly striking is that he's risking the image he's spent 7 decades building. Ron Howard has been safe, reliable, uncontroversial, the anti-scandal. By admitting to mental health struggles, by questioning the industry that made him successful, by revealing the costs of his seemingly perfect life, he's making himself vulnerable in ways that could change how he's perceived. But Ron says he's reached a point where maintaining the facade is more exhausting than telling the truth. At 70, having achieved everything he set out to achieve professionally, he's finally prioritizing his own well-being over his image. Ron is also speaking out about ageism in Hollywood, though from a different perspective than most. While he's still able to get films made, he's noticed a shift in how he's perceived and treated. The industry that once saw him as a wunderkind director now sometimes treats him as out of touch, too old school, not edgy enough for contemporary audiences. After spending his entire life in Hollywood, Ron is experiencing what happens when the industry decides you're no longer fresh or relevant. Ironically, this is forcing him to confront the same fears that plagued Maureen O'Hara, fears of obsolescence, of being valued primarily for past accomplishments rather than current potential. It's a humbling experience, he admits, but also clarifying. It's revealing how much of his self-worth has been tied to Hollywood's validation. Perhaps most controversially, Ron is now questioning whether his success story should be held up as an example for young performers. For years, he's been the proof that child stars can make it, that with the right support and choices, kids can work in Hollywood and turn out fine. But Ron now argues that his story shouldn't be used to justify putting children in the entertainment industry. Even in the best-case scenario, which he arguably represents, the costs are significant. The loss of normal childhood, the pressure, the identity confusion, the decades of anxiety, and the feeling of never quite knowing who you are beneath the performed self. If that's the best-case scenario, Ron asks, what does that say about the system? Shouldn't we be protecting children from this, rather than celebrating the rare few who manage to survive it relatively intact? Ron's timing in breaking his silence is significant. He's at a stage of life where legacy becomes important, where the question shifts from what more can I achieve to what do I want to be remembered for and what truths do I need to tell before it's too late. He's watched friends and colleagues pass away with their truths untold, their struggles hidden, their public images preserved but incomplete. Ron has decided he doesn't want that. He wants his full story told, not just the sanitized version that's been presented for public consumption. This means acknowledging the pain alongside the success, the costs alongside the achievements, the struggles alongside the triumphs. What Ron Howard is revealing isn't a scandal in the tabloid sense. He's not confessing to crimes or exposing others' misdeeds, though he is being more honest about industry dynamics than he's ever been before. What he's revealing is something perhaps more profound and more unsettling. He's showing us that even the success stories come at enormous cost, that Hollywood's exploitation isn't limited to the obvious disasters, and that the smiling face we've seen for 7 decades has been masking pain, anxiety, and questions that he's only now beginning to fully explore. Ron Howard's silence breaking is forcing us to reconsider not just his story, but our entire understanding of child stardom and what we're willing to sacrifice in the name of entertainment. As Ron moves into what he calls the final chapter of his career, he's committed to being more honest, more vulnerable, and more willing to challenge the industry that made him. He's working on a documentary about child actors, not a celebration, but a critical examination of the system and its costs. He's speaking out in support of legislation that would further protect young performers. And he's encouraging other former child stars to tell their truths, to stop pretending that success means they weren't damaged by the experience. This is Ron Howard's new mission, using his platform and credibility to advocate for changes he wishes had been in place during his own childhood. It's a form of redemption, perhaps, or at least an attempt to ensure that future generations don't pay the same price he did for entertaining the world. The silence is broken, and what Ron Howard is revealing is indeed not good, not because it's scandalous, but because it's a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about an industry we love and the real human cost of the entertainment we consume.